So you got yourself a brand new R6 Mark II, but when you take it out of the box and turn it on, it doesn't quite work the way you want it to. And when you hit that menu button and navigate through all the options, it can be quite overwhelming and frustrating because you're not quite sure what to actually change to get the best out of the camera. So let me help you set up your own R6 Mark II with the settings that have proven to work for me in the field. When it comes to modern mirrorless cameras with fantastic eye tracking abilities, I like to set it up with double back button autofocus. My base autofocusing mode is spot autofocus with most of the tracking, or as much of the tracking as you can disable. So in theory, the autofocus now works pretty much like the autofocus you're used from a DSLR camera, where you have a little autofocusing field in the middle that you can also move all over the viewfinder. So whenever you want to focus on something, you can move the autofocusing field on that area, press one of the rear buttons, and the camera will focus on that exact area. However, we obviously also want to use the fantastic eye tracking that I use most of the time. So I assign eye tracking to the AF on button. So whenever I hold down that button, the camera will engage eye tracking and jump onto the subject's eye as long as I hold the button down. When I let go, it will revert back to the spot autofocus. So when I will share my settings of the R6 Mark II now, keep in mind that I will be removing the ability to focus from the shutter button and assign it to the star button and the AF on button on the back of the camera. Of course, you can still use your front button to focus as well, but you will make a few different changes in the settings compared to me. If you're a bit more old school and find this video maybe too fast, I also have PDF setup guides available for different camera models, including the R6 Mark II, which I've linked for you down there in the description. Let's jump right in and set up this R6 Mark II. So when I turn the camera on, the first button I press is the Q button to activate the quick menu, because the quick menu already allows us to change a lot of things very easily. So in the first section where I select the autofocus area, I select spot autofocus and I press info to disable the tracking in the spot autofocus mode. Because with the spot autofocus, I just want to focus on whatever area I want to. I don't really want the camera to pick certain areas for me or track something all over the viewfinder. Next, I also like to select C-RAW or compressed RAW on my cameras. The quality is very similar to RAW and there's really only upside to using C-RAW. So your files are smaller, you need less hard drives, smaller memory cards, and you have a much larger buffer size available. From there, I set the drive mode and I like to set it to H+, the faster shooting mode, because I shoot a lot of birds, a lot of action, so I want to take full advantage of the camera's ability to take as many frames as possible. When it comes to the metering mode, I would suggest to use evaluative metering because it gives you generally the best results when it comes to bird photography. It doesn't matter for me because I shoot full manual where I set shutter speed, aperture and ISO myself, so the metering of the camera doesn't really play a big role. When it comes to the white balance, I like to shoot with a fixed white balance, usually around 52 or 5400 Kelvin, because that generally gives me a good starting point. If you're shooting auto white balance, that's also totally fine. But what often happens, especially if you're shooting in low light, that the files turn really blue because the camera just doesn't really get the colors right. So let's jump into the first red menu. We already discussed we're going to set it to C-RAW. You see also this funny thing down here at the bottom that says digital teleconverter. And that's something I would definitely turn off because it only works in JPEG mode and it gives you a horrendous image quality because it just crops in more to your files, which really doesn't make any sense, and to be better off just shooting wide and cropping afterwards. In the second red menu, I like to turn off everything pretty much. I like to turn off HDR shooting, HDR mode, auto lighting optimizer and highlight tone priority, because all of these can slow down your camera at times, and when you're shooting RAW, this doesn't really matter in the first place. Next menu, there's nothing really to change for us. In the fourth menu, we've already discussed that I like to shoot a set white balance, 5400 Kelvin in this case, and I like to set the camera to Adobe RGB because my whole workflow is in Adobe RGB, but this is also something that you can later change during the editing process. When it comes to the picture style, it doesn't really matter when you're shooting RAW because the picture style doesn't affect the RAW file. However, it severely affects the image that you're seeing on the back of the camera, that JPEG preview that the camera creates for you. So I usually like to stick to the standard picture profile because I think that gives me the best representation of my RAW file. In the menu number 5, it's up to you whether you want to leave the lens aberration corrections on or not. It kind of is a philosophy thing. Do you think it's better for your camera to kind of do some digital optimization, or do you want to do that all afterwards in Photoshop during the editing process? I usually like to turn all these off. I also turn off the long exposure noise reduction and the high ISO noise reduction, because both of these, if anything, slow down the camera, and if we're shooting RAW and have great noise reduction software, we don't really need to have these on. In red menu number 6, I usually have everything disabled, but this is where you can activate the RAW burst mode, where the camera will start taking a loop of images whenever you hold down the shutter button. So even before you actually take a photo, the camera will already start recording some images. However, I only find it sort of somewhat useful because it's quite difficult to actually get the RAW files. You need to use DPP or select the files on the back of the camera because they're all kind of in one big file. And also the biggest downside of this is that once you use the pre-burst mode, you have to wait until the buffer is cleared to be able to take another image. On the R6 Mark II, I definitely like to use the electronic shutter mode with 40 frames per second because it's just cool to take that many images. I haven't really used the mechanical or first curtain electronic shutter on this camera because I think the rolling shutter is good enough that I can basically shoot electronic shutter all the time. If you're a flash shooter, you will have to use mechanical or first curtain electronic shutter because the R6 Mark II, unlike the R3, cannot use flash in the electronic shutter mode. Menu number 8. Image stabilization, I leave it on. I turn off digital image stabilization because it crops into your image. If you want to change the quick menu, this is where you do it. I also disable the touch shutter because I don't want the camera to focus and take an image whenever I press the back of the camera, which I find very annoying and not very useful at all. When it comes to the image review, I want to be in full control of it, so I only want it to appear when I press the play button on the back of the camera, so I just turn off all image reviews. Red menu number 9 is quite interesting because here we can set a whole bunch of things up. The display simulation I set to exposure simulations because then you can see your exposure in the viewfinder, and it's very hard to take too bright or too dark images, so this is a fantastic feature. The next menu is the shooting info display menu, and this is very interesting because here we can set up what we want to see in the viewfinder and the rear of the camera. So when we go into the first one, screen info settings, we can select which of these screens we actually want to see appear when we press the info button or toggle the info button. And what's even cooler, you can also decide certain things to appear or not appear in some of these. So if you say you only like to see your autofocusing point, you can basically deactivate everything else, or you can customize the settings a little bit. And you can do that by going to one of the modes and then pressing the info button. And on the next one, we can do the same thing for the viewfinder. Vertical display I turn on. I don't like grid lines, so I turn that off, but if you're doing a lot of landscape photography, you'll find the grid lines quite useful. Now it comes to the histogram that you can display in the viewfinder, which is also tremendously helpful to get your exposure right, because we can see that we can expose as far to the right as possible without clipping the edge of the frame. So having the exposure simulation in the viewfinder and the histogram activated will be a fantastic way to basically nail your exposure every time. I also like to set the size to small because the standard, the large histogram, I just find too big. It covers too much of my image. And the last one, lens info display, you can just decide what you want to have displayed in your viewfinder when it comes to focal length, for instance. When it comes to the display performance, I like to set it up to smooth because it looks better. However, it will use more batteries. In menu number 10, this is kind of the settings you're selecting when you're pressing the record button from photo mode, which is not really useful. I would always recommend to actually change to video when you want to take video, because that red record button only kind of records in a strange sort of automatic mode. But I still just set it up just for an emergency where I just quickly press that button. So the movie recording size, I go to 4K 25 frames per second. In my case, because I'm in a poor country, so if you're in North America and you have an NTSC video format, then you'll likely be at 4K and 30 frames per second. So now we come to the interesting part, the autofocusing menu. And here I like to set it up in the way that we discussed earlier in this video with double back button autofocus. And our first task for that is to basically disable all the tracking and have spot autofocus at our base mode. We already set up most of that in the quick menu, but let's just go through the options here. AF area, we go to spot autofocus. Whole area servo tracking we turn off, because with the spot autofocus, we want to be able to just focus on one spot and not have the camera track it all over the viewfinder. That's what we have the eye tracking for. So we turn that off. Subject to detect, you can leave it on auto, which is probably good in most cases, but since I know I will only really photograph animals with this camera, I set it to animals. When it comes to the eye detection, I disable it because I don't want my spot autofocus to look for eyes or track anything. I will set up a button later for eye tracking in another menu. Apparently on the R6 Mark II, you can now select whether it should go for the right eye or the left eye as well, which is basically something that only works for humans because most animals, unless you're shooting owls for instance, you will only really see one of the eyes at a time anyways. When it comes to switching track subject, I'd left it on 1 for now and that has seemed to work quite well. When it comes to the autofocusing modes, we always want to shoot in servo autofocus where the camera just tracks it all over the field. One shot for animals I don't find very useful, so I set my cameras always up to servo autofocus. And because I'm using double back button autofocus, whenever I let the button go after I focused, the camera will remain in that position on that certain area that it focused on. So the servo autofocus basically functions like a one-shot mode as well. When it comes to the autofocusing cases, I usually have the best experience with using case 1 and changing some of the settings, but I also had good success just leaving it on auto. So for many people, I would just recommend leaving it on auto, but I personally use case 1 and I set the tracking sensitivity to -1 and the acceleration and deceleration also to -1. So to set that up, I hit the right button, and the idea is that I don't want the camera to quickly look for a new subject or be too hyperactive. I want it to grab my subject and then stay on my subject. The pink menu number 3, I think I pretty much left it the way it is. In autofocus in the menu number 4, there's a few interesting settings. The first one is a touch and drag autofocus setting. That allows you to assign a certain area on the back of your camera. So when you hold the camera onto your face, for instance, I can move the autofocusing points with my thumb in the upper right hand corner or in another area that you can assign. The only downside is that if you breathe onto the camera too much or it gets wet, this doesn't really work anymore. So we go into that, we go enable touch and drag autofocus, and then we go positioning myself relative, and the touch area I select the top right. And I put the sensitivity to +1, so it's really sensitive, so I can move the field really easy with not much effort and it moves nice and fast. I didn't limit any autofocusing areas. And then I also set the sensitivity for the joystick on the back of the camera to +1, so when I make a small change on the joystick, it still moves my autofocusing field fast and a fair bit around. What I also really like to turn on is the orientation linked autofocusing points, and I select separate autofocus points only. So if I go from horizontal to vertical mode and back to horizontal mode, it remembers my last autofocusing point that I had activated in horizontal mode, and the same is true for the vertical mode. In autofocus menu number 5, I activated the manual focus peaking settings. I have it on, high, and the color red. Focus guide I have off, and I have the movie servo autofocus enabled. In autofocus menu number 6, we have a very important one, because without these settings, you won't be able to use manual focus on most of the RF lenses. You need to go into your menu and activate electronic full-time manual focus, because then you can intervene with the manual focus at any point in time. If that's not on, you turn the manual focus ring and nothing will happen. Now that we've set up the camera to take great photos, we should also learn to edit these images. So if you're not quite sure to get the absolute most out of your RAW files and make them look amazing, I would really like to help you with my masterclass and my Prosets that are linked for you down there in the description. I know that will help you tremendously to take your images to the next level. With my Prosets, I enable you with just one click to transform your RAW files into a great starting point for the editing process. And in my masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know about Photoshop, and things like cloning, how to remove things, color correction, and just simply how to make your images look all around amazing. The first menu in the blue menu where I change something is number 5, magnification. Because I like the camera to show me the files at 100% whenever I press the magnification button on the back of the camera. So to activate that, we go to magnification, go to actual size. I like to go magnify position from focus point. So wherever the camera focused on, it will zoom in to 100% on that area, which is the bird's eye or the bird's head in most cases. And this is exactly the area that I want to check for sharpness. And then on the R6 Mark II, you can also decide whether the camera should then maintain that position when you're scrolling through your images or go back to like the center of the image, for instance. I like for it to maintain the position. So if I zoom through the images, scroll through the images, then it will stay on the bird's eye, for instance. I don't really want it to go back and forth between different spots because then it's hard to compare the sharpness of different images. And in blue menu number 7, there's also something we should activate, and that's the highlight alert, because that will show you on the back of the camera if you have severely exposed areas, because these areas will flash black. A few of these, also called blinkies, are fine because the back of the camera shows you the JPEG and some of these highlights can still be recovered in the RAW file. However, you don't really want to have big black blinking areas in the back of the camera because that will mean there's no detail in these at all. So having the exposure simulation in the viewfinder, the histogram, and the highlight alert enabled will guarantee you to never miss the exposure pretty much. So to activate that, we go to the menu, click highlight alert and enable. If you like seeing the autofocus points in the review on the back of the camera, you can activate that here, but I personally just find that annoying, so I'll leave that off. I didn't make any changes in the purple menu. That's usually just when you want to connect your camera to Wi-Fi, for instance, or to your phone. However, I usually just set the camera to airplane mode because sometimes I use the Wi-Fi to connect the camera to my phone. But if the Wi-Fi is on, at least on an R5, for instance, it slows down your maximum frame rate. So by having the camera on airplane mode, I can be sure that none of these things are actually turned on and interfere with my frames per second. Now to the yellow menu, and there's a few interesting ones in here. The very first one is the record function and card folder selection. And this is a very interesting one because you can pick which card the camera should prioritize if you have 2 cards in the camera. And I would also recommend always having 2 cards in your camera because you can activate something else. And that's the auto switching from one card to the other card once the first card is full, which can be very useful if you're shooting fast action, run out of space on the one card, because instead of the camera stopping and you having to change the card, it instantly keeps writing on the second card and you never miss a shot. And if you want to give a priority to one of the cards, for instance, you always want to write on card 1 first or card 2 first, you go to the bottom here for record play for photos. And if you press info, you can decide which card you want to give priority to. So I find this quite useful when using 2 cards all the time, because usually what happens, you take one card out and the camera will automatically keep shooting on the second card, even if you put the first card back in. But if you activate the priority of card 1, the camera will always write to card 1 first as long as there's enough space on the camera. For some reason, not many people seem to know that you can actually change the file name on your camera, but this is something that I find very useful. And to do that, we go to File Name, and then we need to go to Change User Setting 1. Once we do that, we can delete what's there and then do our own initials or whatever we want in there. Probably best to use the touchscreen. And the only thing you have to remember, if you select Adobe RGB, the first letter will actually not show up. It will have an underscore instead. If you're shooting sRGB, whatever you type in there will be fully visible. In the second yellow menu, the only thing I would change if you're in a country that has a PAL system, like Australia, you select PAL, and if you're in North America, you select NTSC, which basically just determines a frame rate for video, because if you're not picking the right frame rate, it can be happening that your lights are flickering when you're recording in a studio like this, for instance. In yellow menu number 3 is where you can select the optional shutter sound for the electronic shutter and all other sounds on the camera. To do that, you weirdly have to enable the beep, but you can then also quiet the beep later on. And when it comes to power saving, I basically disable everything because I don't really want the camera to turn off all the time or dim the screen. It's just annoying. It saves battery, but I'd rather have a few extra batteries with me than having the camera turn off in a crucial moment. But just in case I forget to turn off the camera in my backpack, I have set it up to turn off itself after 5 minutes, because usually in the field I will touch the camera before the 5 minutes and will stop it from turning off. But in my backpack, I know it will turn off after 5 minutes and not run completely out of battery. And I disable that it turns off the viewfinder because it's sometimes annoying because it takes a little bit of time before the viewfinder comes back on when you hold it onto your eye, and I don't want any delays in the field. So ideally I just want the camera to stay on and it still has decent enough battery life. In menu number 4, I select the screen viewfinder display and I go to Auto 2, where it automatically switches between the viewfinder and the rear screen. The rest in this menu I left pretty much the same. Menu number 5, I think I left everything the same as well. Menu number 6, there's one interesting thing to change. If you go to custom shooting mode And then at the very bottom, you can see auto update settings, and I like to enable that. That means whenever you save the custom mode on this camera and you switch to it and make some changes, like you change the exposure, the camera will remember that change, and next time you go back to that custom mode, it will have your latest settings saved. I find that pretty useful, especially for video, but some of you might also find that very annoying. So depending on how you work, this can be a great setting to enable or disable. If you always want to have the same settings in your custom mode, disable it. But if you like to use kind of a more floating custom mode where whenever you're shooting, you might make a change, you want to keep that change, then enabling the setting is a good idea. Now we go to the orange menu where we also have to make a few changes. On the first one, I didn't make any change. The second one, I left the same as well. And in the third one now, there's a few big steps to change because we have to change some of the buttons to fully be able to use our back button autofocusing. So we go to customize buttons. And the first thing we want to do is to not be able to focus with the shutter button anymore. So we navigate to the shutter button and then select metering start. So now when we press the shutter button, it will only meter, and when you press it fully, it will take images, but it will not autofocus. So it won't interfere with our focusing anymore. And then next, I want to assign eye tracking to the AF on button. So we navigate to the AF on button and then scroll to the menu until we find eye detection autofocus and select that. So now whenever we hold down the AF on button on the back of the camera will engage eye tracking, find a subject for you, and will track it all over the viewfinder. And when we let go, it will stop the eye tracking and revert back to the spot autofocus, base autofocus that we've already set up. However, we're not fully there yet because we still have to assign the focusing to the star button now. So we go to the star button and assign metering and autofocus start. So now whenever we press the star button, it will engage the spot autofocus and will focus on whatever area we focus on with the autofocus field. And if we press the AF on button, it will automatically find the subject and track it all over our viewfinder. So now we have the best of both worlds available just by moving our thumb from the left to the right. What I like to do as well is I like to assign the tracking on and off to this little front button here. So we navigate to that button and select Start Stop Whole Area Autofocus Tracking. So what I can do now if I'm in spot autofocus, I press this little button and the camera will start tracking or looking for a subject in my viewfinder. And if I then engage the star button, the camera will actually track my subject all over the viewfinder. So this can be helpful if I want to navigate or control the camera very tightly, because I can pre-focus on an area with the spot autofocus, press the front button, engage the tracking, and then if I press the star button and hold it down, the camera will actually kind of stay on that area, or if it's your subject, stay on the subject and track it all over your viewfinder. So sometimes when the eye tracking doesn't work as well, this can be a good way to circumvent that, but it's not something that I use a lot, but having that on a button can be helpful in rare cases. Normally that function is set to the set button, but I don't really want the set button to do anything when I press it, because sometimes I accidentally press it, and then if it suddenly starts to engage some tracking mode, it doesn't really work for me. So that I disable everything on the set button. So if I press it, nothing happens on the back of the camera. Orange menu number 4 is where we'll have to do a few changes. First of all, I like to turn off the audio compression. And then I also like to turn on for the camera to release the shutter with the lens off, for instance, if I want to show you how the shutter works. And the next one is probably the most annoying thing on these mirrorless cameras that's set up as active by default, and it's called retract lens on power off. Has it ever happened to you that you're in the field, you pre-focus on something, your camera goes to sleep, or you turn it off, and when you turn it back on, it's completely blurry because the camera completely defocused and you have to find your subject again. That has lost me a lot of images in the beginning until I realized this can be turned off. If you go to retract lens power off and disable it, the camera will now retain the focus. I think this is something that you should definitely change because there's no reason for the camera to lose focus when you turn it off. The only time this feature is useful if you have a lens like the Canon 35mm 1.8 for instance that actually protrudes out when shooting. If you disable the retract lens on power off, this lens will stay in the zoomed out position and can be damaged. So if you have a lens like this, leaving this feature on might be a good idea, but you could also, for instance, save it to a custom mode. So you have one mode for shooting with lenses where you want this feature disabled and one mode for lenses where you might need it enabled. And then lastly, with the My menu, I haven't set it up yet here, but this can be very helpful because you can actually pick certain things from all these menus and put them into your My menu, and then they're very easily for you to access in the field. So if there's things that you change all the time, I would recommend to putting them into your My menu tab, because then it's much easier to actually find them and quickly make changes. So now we've set up the R6 Mark II pretty well for photos, I think. We deactivated the focusing from the shutter button and assigned it to the two rear buttons, the star button and the AF on button. If you're not using double back button autofocus, what way have you set up your camera to take advantage of both of the autofocusing methods? But what about video? There's also a few settings we need to change when it comes to the video menu. There's a lot of things that we've already assigned in the photo menu, so we don't need to make as many changes, but there's definitely a few changes we want to make. The first thing we set is the movie recording size or the format. However, there's not that many options on the R6 Mark II anyway, so I just like to select 4K 25 frames per second, and we only have IPB compression available, so that's what we have to go with. I don't really like shooting at 50 or 60 frames per second, and I also don't like shooting at full HD, so the only logical mode as my standard go-to filming mode is 4K 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second if you're in an NTSC country. The R6 Mark II also has the ability to shoot slow motion at 180 frames per second, but that's also only available in full HD, unfortunately, and so I usually leave that turned off. I don't want the camera to crop in at all when it comes to movies. I think it's a 1.6 crop, but why would you want to have that unless you're actually filming something that's really far away? Second menu, I don't change anything. Third one, I don't change anything. For video especially, I also like to shoot with a fixed white balance because then it doesn't change if the light slightly changes, and I find it easier when it comes to the editing process. On the fourth menu, there's something that you can select that you will either hate or love. I love shooting in log format because it gives me a lot more dynamic range, and it allows me to get more scope when it comes to editing and how I want my video files to look. However, if you decide to shoot in log format, you have to be aware that you will have to edit your images, because without log, like now, you can see how the file looks really flat and not very pleasant. So you have to do a lot of editing and color grading to make the log files look good. So if you want to take video and not do much editing, don't use log format. If you're not shooting a log, then the picture style in the video format will determine the look of your videos. I usually like to select neutral here to give me a nice neutral look, and I can still do some editing later on. If you select a too aggressive look, your video might look too funny or over sharpened. We already talked about the lens aberration correction. Here you can turn it on or off, and I turn off the high ISO noise reduction because usually I like to do the noise reduction in DaVinci Resolve. Red menu number 6, this is quite interesting because the R6 has the ability to actually pre-record videos. So it keeps running a loop. So whenever you press the actual record button, it will have also recorded the last 5 seconds prior to you actually pressing the record button. So whenever you're a little bit too slow in pressing the record button, you won't miss the scene because the camera has already pre-recorded the 5 seconds before you actually press the button. This is kind of like a better version of the raw burst mode. In red menu number 7, I'd go to shutter button function for movies. On half press, I select to start metering and servo OF. On full press, I select that it starts the recording because I think that's quite good and much easier than fiddling with that little button on top of the camera. So in video mode, all I need to do to record is press the shutter button and then press it again to stop the video. Another very interesting one we have in this menu as well is the zebra settings. Zebras show us whenever there's areas that are too bright in our video. And for video, this is crucial. In photo, we can often recover areas that are a bit too bright with the highlight recovery. In video, whatever is too bright is gone. It's basically a whole burn into a video file. So with the zebras, I like to turn them on. I like zebra pattern 1, and I set zebra level 1 to 90 ±5% and zebra level 2 to 95%. So now whenever I film, it will show me these lines going through the image in all the areas that are too bright or too dark. If you set up these zebra settings too aggressively, you'll basically have these zebras showing up all the time. So I only like to set it up in a way that they show if I'm just about to clip certain areas. The shooting info display is pretty much exactly the same for the photo, so I didn't really make any changes there. In the autofocus menu, I've enabled the movie servo autofocus. And for movies or video recording, I want the camera to pick my subject and track it all over my viewfinder automatically. Because often when I'm filming, I'm not touching my camera to not introduce extra shake into the video. So I activate the whole area autofocus. The subject to detect, you can leave it on auto or animals. Because I'm filming mainly animals, unless I'm filming myself, I have it set to animals, or when I film people, I have it set to people. And then I have the eye detection set to auto. Switching track subject, I left the same. Movie servo speed, I left the same as well. And then I set the tracking sensitivity to -2 so it doesn't jump off my subject too quickly. Number 3, I didn't do anything. In the video menu, I left the touch and drag settings off because there's really no point moving the autofocus with my thumb because I want the camera to do all the tracking for me. And I can't have the manual focus peaking in video mode because I have the zebras activated. Autofocus menu number 6 we've already set up in the photo settings, so we don't need to make any changes there. Blue menu, we don't need to do anything. Purple menu, we don't need to do anything. And the yellow menu, we don't need to do anything. And you guessed right, we also don't need to make any changes in the orange menu, at least for video. So as you can see, if you set up the camera right in photo mode, then there's not that many changes to do in the video mode. You basically just want to select the right recording format, zebras, whether you want to shoot in C-Log or not, and make sure that the autofocusing settings are correct so the camera tracks your subject all over the frame. And in saying that, I hope that you will really enjoy some of these settings that I showed you today and that will help you to get more out of your R6 camera because it's a fantastic camera body. If you haven't seen it already, I also have posted an in-depth field review about the R6 Mark II that you will also enjoy very much. So let me know all your settings in the comments. Is there certain settings that I use that you wouldn't use or the other way around? Make sure to let me know. Also give me a thumbs up for this video and make sure to subscribe to the channel somewhere down there, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.